Thank you. I thought I would, the title I've selected for addressing a motley group of scholars in different directions on the topic, subject of Africa in general, is Afro-pessimism and Afro-renaissance, the critic's voice among warring images. I think that should cover everything. The outlook, let me be straight with you, is not too uplifting. But you decide. The original context in which I first described that expression, warring to African realities, virtually 2 decades ago, did not intend that expression to be literal. Unfortunately, today, it does happen to be not merely literal, but virulently so. My original context actually weighed more on the side of the artistic enterprise, nothing to do really with the theater of war to which the continent has now reverted with near perverse desperation. At the time, however, I was commenting on the nature of art itself, and specifically of the perennial contest between the art of power and the power of art. That context enabled me to call attention to a genre of popular art that I sometimes refer to as mobile murals, lamenting the fact that the warnings inscribed and even projected pictorially on these murals did not seem to catch the attention of African leadership, resulting, predictably, in alienation from their prime constituencies and a diminished public orientation. Few will dare claim to have detected much improvement in leadership orientation since these original remarks, which took place at the Africa Unity headquarters in Addis Ababa on the eve of the establishment of the new socio-political umbrella for the continent. It is thus a useful theme to resurrect in any resumption of one's obsessive dialogue with the continent, asking ourselves whether the urged wisdoms of the motor park, the marketplaces, or factory floor have percolated through to the hallowed precincts, wherever power is exercised and dispensed for the supposed betterment of the lives of the home of the black race. Maybe some of you have seen these murals. The more adventurous here may have even traveled in them, assuming you've never been knocked down by one of them, or were in one that skidded off the road and crashed into an obstacle. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here listening to me tonight. Often brash, crude, exhibiting an untutored draftsmanship and prodigal with bizarre color combinations, this pop art offers nonetheless statements of political astuteness, pithy comments on the day-to-day realities as well as social and individual aspirations. It gave me much gratification to propose selections from this instructive art on that occasion of the transition from the Organization of Africa Unity to Africa Union. And my suggestion was that it would make an ideal, a selection from these comments would make an ideal logo or motto for those who were charged with transforming the former rickety conveyance, creating a brand new entity, so it would not be yet another case of pouring old wine into new bottles. As you must all be aware, of course, by now, Africa Union was intended to be a replacement of that ancient political conveyance on which the African peoples appear to have traveled since independence, only to arrive at nowhere, or worse, at a dead end. Would the new conveyance be an improvement? At least those mobile murals to which I refer, and surely by now you've become aware of the kind of vehicles I am talking about, they at least get you somewhere sooner or later, if they don't crash, of course, on the way or break down en route. I'm not the first to have lauded the trenchant politics of these popular art forms and their sayings. The Ghanaian novelist Ike Weyama constructed his scatological architecture around one such canvas in his landmark novel of the early 70s titled The Beautiful, spelled with a Y, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. I find it personally regrettable that that biting, not prophetic and also very well-observed exposition of African leadership, the malaise which appear to have overtaken it. I regret very much that such texts appear to have gone off school curricula and bookshelves in recent years. Ike Weyama was then domiciled in the United States. And while that fictional debut received critical acclaim from mainstream journals and literary media, most African Americans and much of the liberal left vilified that novel. They felt that it painted a bleak, pessimistic, and unbalanced picture of the emerging African nations. Even my own late compatriot, Chinua Achebe, did not mince words about it. It's alleged pessimism, which he felt pandered to white Eurocentric views of the African continent. He even deplored Arma's excremental metaphors as literally unacceptable. Now, that fictional work itself emerged nearly a decade and a half after the African-American novelist Richard Wright, published his own impressions of a continent, a narrative of indictment that followed his visit to that same continent, his first visit. It was a visit undertaken in hope and promise. He was especially disillusioned with Ghana, a country it visited in high hopes. Ghana was then gearing up to become the first independent black nation in Africa since the first settlement of former slaves on the same western coastland that became known as Liberia. One can only wonder what Richard Wright would have made of his own repatriates. Had he lived to witness the fate that eventually overtook that landmark settlement as it reeled under the bloody dictatorship of a certain Master Sergeant Doe. We all still recall that native song, I hope, the play on the title of Wright's famous novel is unintended, but quite appropriate. Mr. Sergeant Doe actually took on the role, affected the role of a native liberator. Since his action was intended to compensate and to punish, it was taken on behalf of the inland natives, the despised natives, oppressed by the coastal aristocratic returnees who felt they were in a superior class. These newcomers unwisely, but not unexpectedly, operated a governance approach and indeed cultivated social attitudes of class discrimination against the inland natives, a discriminatory proceeding that was in effect not much different from what became known in South Africa as apartheid. As we all know today, it all collapsed. That is, the state of Liberia collapsed into a brutal civil war that set a primal benchmark in dehumanization in regional wars along that same coast. Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, etc. The ensuing civil war virtually consumed that mere sliver of real estate of Liberia until a democratic resolution was eventually brokered by the combined efforts of the United Nations and the Organization of Africa Unity. Providing Africa, and let that positive note of consolation be not understated, the resolution provided Africa with her first and so far the only female president on that continent, Eileen Johnson Sirleaf. At least we can do a bit of breast beating, point to the United States, the supposed bastion of human equality, and demand, when will you produce your first female president? From Richard Wright, best known for his novel Native Son, but cited here for his reflections on Africa, especially his Black Power, subtitled A Record of Reactions in a Land of Pathos. Recall that this was published in 1954, just 4 years before Ghana set the pace by becoming the first independent nation. So from Richard Wright, African-American, through Aikweama to Keith Richburg, all the way to Karl Mayer, the roll call of the so-called Afro-pessimists is lengthy. I hope some of us here still recall Keith Richburg, who was perhaps the most scabrous of that line. Richburg, in fact, went overboard completely, even to the extent of regretting the skin of his color. He was African correspondent for Washington Post. He covered much of Africa's regional wars and massacres. They churned not only his stomach, but his mind. And he openly heaped praise on those who captured his grandmother and sold her into slavery so that as a descendant, he became an American and could forget that he was ever linked with such a barbaric continent as Africa. But this strident repudiation should never have been taken in isolation. That has always remained my demurrer. Admittedly extreme self-loathing, it merely followed a familiar tradition that takes numerous forms, of which the art of the mobile mural with which we began, which in fact forms the substance of the ongoing digression in the first place, is merely a part, just a modernist proletariat variant of all these writers. I place it on a par with what I sometimes call the crown and clown tradition, even in feudal society, which serves to bring the powerful down a notch or two in self-regarding. That privileged retainer, sometimes known as the court jester, takes liberties, as you know, with spouting home truths, trenchant criticisms of and advice to power openly, even in the most solemn assembly, right in the ruler's face. Of course, the mobile mural takes a different, far more diffuse form, obviously far more open and impersonal, but it all serves the same purpose. Aikweama's choice of a title for his novel was taken directly from one of the inscriptions on this public transportation. It was very much in that same spirit, though of course very elaborate. And its contents were just as basic, as raucous, unsparing, unpalatable, but true to life. The beautiful ones are not yet born. Those who read that novel, or have simply traveled on the West African and increasingly Eastern and Central African, and even in parts of Latin America, Mexico in particular, would certainly have encountered those murals. Aikweama's title was taken for one such. In Ghana, the vehicle is known as the trotro. In Nigeria, it's known as Mami Wagon, Danfo, or Bole Kaja. The last literally means, come down, let's slug it out. And the colorful inscriptions on their chassis have formed the subject of more than a few monographs on culture and social mores, as well as coffee table photo essays. The images, as well as inscriptions on these trucks, also known as passenger lorries, are often taken directly from or made to illustrate familiar proverbs, expressions of traditional wisdoms, extracts from social musical lyrics, including sound bites from the most unlikely sources wrenched from their original contexts. These vary from the Bible, Shakespeare, or the Quran, to Indian or Kung Fu films, or even a bit of commercial jingle heard on radio or television and co-opted for its pithy sound and contextual relevance. For instance, you might have a painting of a diminutive David just giving a kung fu kick at the neck of Goliath, and with the expression "Ewenla oni ruwewe" in Yoruba. That means the big leaf shall not triumph over the smaller. As for the Quranic inscriptions, those mostly appear in the Arabic, and these are a favorite because the calligraphy enables the painter to go to town in any direction. I saw extracts from Shakespeare, where they pick them up, heaven knows, but then always remember Shakespeare has been very, very popular, not just on the African continent, on the Asian continent also. You'll find an inscription such as "the evil that men do," which of course is taken from Julius Caesar. The murals move beyond, therefore they move beyond strict art of the pictorial. They strike me more often as open-air ethical tutorials, which is why in Addis Ababa I proposed an exercise, voluntary or compelled, on African leaders, that they should be required to take composite trips on some of these vehicles, which illustrate the power of art, not just the power of art, in fact, but the art for power. That is, power as an instruction of popular art as an instruction for power, for its contextualization within real life, for meditation on power by its possessors. Art simply for thoughtful meditation on responsibilities. This, I propose, would involve taking various trips from one conveyance to the other, just to see how the other side lives. Not only see how they live, but how they die. Above all, to remark the resilience that is often the sole surviving element in society. As society itself collapses, they would experience, indeed, the other side of existence. Just a few further sampling among the favorites. You have expressions like "no telephone to heaven," "chop small, no quench," or its variant, "chop small, quench small," "chop big, quench big," or this one, "the young shall grow," which has even become the name for the title of a motor transportation company. Another one, "monkey they walk, baboon they chop." Another favorite, "lizard belly dey ground, no be stomachache, na hunger." Another, "na death make crayfish bend." There's Allah Day, of course. And then one of the most popular, "no condition is permanent." Ah yes, no condition is permanent. If only that prescription was taken to heart and acted upon, Africa would not be in the mess it is today through contestation with just sheer naked power. These mobile murals rebuke a tendency to deny or dismiss the critical vision and its expression as the self-indulgent domain of the alienated sophisticates of African society, conveniently demonized as products of Western and European inclinations. That has shortchanged pre-colonial modes of expression and proved a dangerous, ultimately chastening deflection from reality, again and again. Naturally, without giving full weight to the art of dissent as a cultural given in its own right, it must be difficult to understand the tenacity with which the contemporary artists, in the main, manifest this critical temperament in their works, accepting in turn the consequences to themselves, including in a number of cases, even the loss of life. The immediate post-independence burst of creativity, on which the expression African Renaissance was often bestowed, recorded the truncation of careers of many such voices of that Renaissance. One recalls the early Martyrdom, for instance, in the early 60s, of the likes of Dan Kintu, the playwright, Ben Kadadwa, playwright, in Idi Amin's Uganda, all the way to the judicial elimination of Ekensa Ruwiwa, novelist and environmentalist, at the hands of one of the most notorious of such terminators, that maximum ruler who aimed to become nothing less than president for life of the Nigerian nation, would meet his own end, also being shoved unceremoniously into a hole at midnight in his own hometown after his death, in a manner that recalled the fates of the Caesar Borgias of Italy. The unfortunate illiterate ruler obviously did not read that mural, which admonished him, no condition is permanent. Many people they tend to react skeptically to the manner of his death. But that monstrosity, by name Sonny Abacha, did die in a bloodless coup, poisoned unwittingly by a prostitute who was imported from Pakistan. I stake my investigative reputation on that truth, albeit it's an unimportant one, but just as a matter of historical value. And the band of exiles, prison graduates, as we call them, it's an endless roll call. Okot Kabitek, David Badiri of Malawi, Nuruddin Farah of Somalia, still wandering around South Africa, Ngugiwa Thiong'o in the United States, Mitere Mugo, late from Kenya, novelist and historian, Tasmir Nien, also historian, who barely escaped with his life from Sekou Touré's Guinea, pioneer, that is Sekou Touré, of the infamous electric box for the re-education of his political opponents, real or imagined. Sekou Touré was also credited with the elimination of the pioneer Secretary General of the OAU, Diallo Telly. Tasmania, however, did not wait for his induction into the electric box. He accepted a life of exile in Senegal, where he even had to live under protection for a number of years, protected by Leopold Sédar Senghor. Christopher Okibo, however, was that rare instance where the visionary at least made his own choice. He took up arms on behalf of the breakaway state of Biafra and perished on the battlefront. Most others, however, simply fall victims to paranoia of politicians and dictators. We shall leave in its own special bracket the fate of South African writers when apartheid reigned supreme. Now, that was, of course, a unique aberration of its own, one which, at least in terms of state direction and policy, has irreversibly run its course. Prejudicial differences, however, in color and racial characteristics are no different as policies of privilege and deprivation. They're no different from the subtler, not so obvious forms of differentiations in class, social status, or glaring economic apartheid. Ultimately, the effects are experienced within that cleavage between power and privilege on the one hand, and freedom and equality on the other. That is where it becomes important to remind those on the outside that a contemporary writer or artist has emerged from the same history and cultural resource as others who remain steeped near exclusively in pre-colonial modes of expression. We need always to bear that in mind. And these include, of course, a vibrant critical tradition. All modes are, albeit unevenly, preoccupied with social transformation, whose critical mass, when finally arrived at, is often referred to as a renaissance. Renaissance involves, unavoidably, selectivity. That requires clearing the ground of ancient clutter to make room for vibrant new growth while refurbishing the salvaged values from the past. The process is therefore strengthened and its practitioners themselves seen as unalienated when traditional society is recognized as precursor in the vibrant art of social criticism. Thus is the power of art manifested in its rounded, holistic, all-encompassing authenticity, side by side with the more familiar, better patronized, that is, the art of power, otherwise known as court or palace arts. That latter constitutes, one admits, the laudatory and ceremonial, very attractive, often very seductive, and especially in the case of sculptures, classical and idealized, which often overwhelms the iconoclastic, the negative. In other words, the classic bronzes that we encounter, the pains we listen to, the lineage narratives and glorifying epics, they did flourish side by side with satiric masks and poetry, the lampoons, the comic dances, inbuilt into the cultural life of society from time immemorial, be it in theater, song, sculpture, into the very language even of drums, and even in solemn ritual. You will always encounter elementary, individual portrayals of the grotesque in society, of deflation of power. The classic Benin or Ife bronzes have emerged from the same crucible, the same creative furnace in the making. The grimacing, the distortive, the masks that satirize power and panoply. In short, criticism. Let us also bear in mind that we're not speaking of critical art as simply the art of disruption. Critical art also involves the mission of public enlightenment. And by public enlightenment, I'm talking about the dissemination of the alternative view. Take a look at the masquerade, for instance, especially. The masquerade, Yoruba masquerade of gender impersonation, the well-known gelede. What wisdom does the gelede, this gender impersonation, what wisdom does it teach modern society? Simply that transvestism or bisexuality has been with humanity for ages. It is neither radical nor decadent. It simply is an aspect of nature that should therefore inform the attitude of the mind and induce social toleration of difference. And yet, there did reign, until recently, one tin dictator in Gambia, Yahya Jammeh, who threatened to cut off the heads of all homosexuals in his country. Mugabe, going apoplectic before an international gathering where he was supposed to lay before this assemblage of would-be donors, lenders, technocrats, to lay before them the priorities for his national development. I was present at one such high-level international gathering at The Hague. And what Robert Mugabe did, how he spent his allotted time, because there were several heads of state present, he spent all that time just ranting. The word is accurately chosen. Ranting against homosexuality without remembering one item that brought him to The Hague in the first place. And then come home to my own front. What did the Senate spend its time doing? For several days debating a bill to criminalize whatever happens between consenting adults in their own private spaces. Even one went as far as proposing capital punishment. And yet, there, even in traditional society, you have these masquerades, not just the Gelede alone, masquerades which actually present as part and parcel of nature's existence bisexuality, and so on and so forth. But others outside believe that society, African society, is one which they call consensus society, where there's no deviation of opinion, no deviation of worldview. Everything is by consensus. I think that even different trees grow by consensus on the African continent. And so the expression warring is not an exaggeration. Warring images as a product of power, self-consolidation, intolerance of criticism. These have become a literal condition that unites both art and actuality on the African continent, joining the creative minds, making the creative minds turn up time and time again as primarily endangered species. And not just writers, of course, artists, musicians, and epic reciters. But at least writers are of age, of choice. We mustn't stay too long in the territory of creative victimology. Writers at least are old enough, they are of age, they can choose. They can choose silence, they can choose exile, they can even take to arms where they are sufficiently impassioned and feel impotent over the power of their art, and they see society degraded beyond recovery. But what do we say about children? What do you say about the African children and their condition today? They cannot choose. And yet they also find themselves under a state of siege, frequently degraded, battered, and traumatized in ways that the now matured writer and artist could never have envisaged during his or her own rites of passage through childhood. Shall we take on one or two expressions of such childhood sensibilities that have entered into such a rapid, horrifying descent? Now that debasement of childhood is what frightens many of us on that continent. In the bruising liberation wars of Angola, one of the longest and fiercest against foreign domination, especially in terms of settler colonialism in Africa, a tenacious exaction by Portuguese determinism, the following lament emerged from the pen of the Angolan writer, poet Costa Andrade. He wrote, "The mothers of Angola have fallen with their sons." Yes, a lament. And a lament can provide solace, That is the provenance of poetry. The lament can even be purifying, can induce a sense of catharsis. We know that some of the poetry of war and warfare, that uncontrollable spasm of human incontinence that instigates the cause for the lament in the first place, we know that this can prove cathartic, inducing closure, even redeeming humanity. But now let us bring ourselves forward in years from those anti-colonial lines, the anti-colonial wars of the 60s and 70s in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, wars that gave birth to such lines of Costa Andrade, lined, etched in deep pathos. The lyrics, Andrade, Agostinho Neto, Kofi Awuno, Chris Obi, etc., etc. Let's take a stride forward in years to our present, to wars as currently prosecuted on that same continent. I speak here of wars that lately engulfed the West African countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, or the East and Central African countries of the Congo, of Rwanda. It is highly unlikely that such scenarios today will produce those lines of deep pathos and solace. We are more likely to encounter such lacerating lines as the mothers of Angola are violated by their sons. It's a harsh fact, difficult to account for, but a level of barbarism, of the violence, defilement of humanity has become the norm. That norm of depravity sometimes appears to have superseded the recorded inhumanities of the colonial wars, omitting perhaps the Algerian and the Kenyan, and on a level I was never known in the history of pre-colonial internecine wars, which the Western world preferred to call tribal wars, from the West African coast to the Central Highlands and eastern shelf of the continent. Neither the narratives of war nor the epics that have come down to us, be these the corpus of the Sundiata or the narratives of legendary figures like Chaka the Zulu, Ningiswayo, the Matabele, even the Nigerian Civil War, have prepared us for this. Nothing in clan narratives of war exploits transmitted from generation to generation equals the now accustomed passages of human degradation that is inflicted on youth. Even the role of memory on these not so distant times simply does not reactivate inter-clan enmities and generational bitterness as we have encountered in the effects on youth in the past decade or two. The new dimension constitutes a mystery affliction, almost akin to the recent outbreak of coronavirus, and is manifested most distressingly in that phenomenon of child malformation, a numbing pathology of early sadism that became entrenched in several regions of civil conflict. The child, as victim of circumstances, is a feature of modern warfare that we know everywhere. It is one that is accustomed, the one to which we are accustomed, even though, of course, that is not a pleasant reality. But the actual targeting of children as a strategic component of warfare is something quite recent, a post-independence aberration, at least in much of the African continent. The status of the child as victim, as we said, has proved one of double negative designation. First, as a vulnerable target, the object of adult cruelty. But next, as the subject, the unthinking instrument for the infliction of mind-boggling cruelties on others. In either role, that blissful passage of innocence is lost. The child's humanity destroyed, the function of the poet or griot evasive, muted with embarrassment. It is a near impossible task to extract the sheerest poetic threnody from what we have come to know on this continent in the words of the 3-4 decades, those internally directed fratricidal wars. What has been left for many poets, the traditional barometer of emotions, has been deflection, exile, and then the poetry of distant evocation, of the nostalgia of a vanished idyll. I don't know how many of you here have ever heard the expression short sleeves or long sleeves. Short sleeves or long sleeves. Well, that expression has nothing to do with sartorial choices. On overrunning a village or town, one that was merely suspected of favoring the opposing side, failing to show sufficient, perhaps, ardor for the invaders, or indeed, simply, all too often, simply evoked by the roving band fixated on a warped notion that they must leave a mark, a souvenir of their passage. The leader of a rebel pack would single out a number of the inhabitants, male and female, and put to them the question, short sleeves or long sleeves? It meant simply, do you want your amputation at the wrist or at the elbow? This was the choice behind the macabre question. And all too often, the wielder of the machete, under the stern glare of the commander, was a child. From compulsion, it became a sport. From a sport, a craving. Then a gleeful addiction to what is now a way of life. Is this limited to war zones alone? The answer, alas, is no. Not unless we revise our definitions and acknowledge that a country like mine, for instance, be redesignated in its entirety a war zone. That would not be entirely inaccurate. And unfortunately, I'm not even referring to where war is taking place, like let us say in the Delta region, or even in those areas which you might just call still lingering memories of intertribal disputes. No, I'm speaking of actual conduct, the warping of childhood temperament in so many directions. We're speaking here even of the conduct of religious fundamentalists who go to schools, not only kill teachers, not only kill children, but compel children to kill others of a different faith. It is as if a totally new breed of humanity is being created under our very noses, while we dispute whether or not it's right for people of the same sex to make love to one another. Humanity has drained from much of our childhood, of our childhood generation today. What one child was compelled to do to his mother, he will do to others without compunction. I've met victims, for instance, of motherhood rape by children. And when those children are taken through that kind of initiation, one can only quote the poet Philip Larkin, "Never such innocence again." So now, with the future being so compromised in the person of children, we come to the question, how is it possible for voices from within such a zone of fundamentalist desecration to even begin to think of an African Renaissance? Yeah, that expression has become the conjure word on the tongue of African leaders, to the extent that there is quite even a number of establishments set up on the continent for the actualization of that project of rebirth. Publications, NGOs, conferences, civil institutions, plus media projects. There's even a statue in Dakar erected, a Mongol statue erected to the African Renaissance. And there was even a 13-page television series embarked upon in collaboration with several African nations, a 13-part series by the British, one of the British television stations, I've forgotten which one now, to be titled boldly, The African Renaissance. Even while promising not to fudge the negative issues, the title itself was sufficiently revealing, explicit in its declaration of faith in African Renaissance. I've not seen the ultimate product, but I do recall being informed as far back as some years ago that some of the episodes had been completed and the series in entirety was expected to culminate in a huge theatrical manifestation. I recall also that by coincidence, just as I was preparing what was in effect a forerunner to this particular lecture, an address on the theme of the African Renaissance, I received a call from the BBC radio, this time, definitely the BBC radio, asking if I would agree to be interviewed for a program to be titled The Renaissance Generation. Other Africans being interviewed, I learned, would include Chinua Achebe, Chinamanda Adichie, Bin Yabanga Wainaya, Mahmoud Mandana. Forgive me if you're here and I mispronounce your name. I shall pay a penalty, don't worry. Professor John Hargreaves, etc. Regarding this new designation, however, I had never thought of myself as belonging to a Renaissance generation. I think I'll qualify that a little bit. Yes, once upon a time, we did believe ourselves to be the Renaissance generation. In fact, I remember we couldn't wait to finish our studies abroad and return to the African continent to create this Renaissance front to propel the continent into the 21st century, in which, incidentally, in case you haven't noticed, we now find ourselves. Needless to say, I politely declined to be interviewed these few years ago. I chose not to be reminded, at least not too often, of Langston Hughes's poem, A Dream Deferred. We have to bear in mind, however, that it was indeed, when we speak about children and the corruption of the future, the danger to a continent of its loss of a generation, loss, in ethical terms. It was indeed under apartheid South Africa that future, ironically, began to collapse. Remember, the youth of that South African continent was seen almost as a compact identity, a compact generation. It was there, I think, that African childhood began to lose its innocence. The examples I've given of the experience of civil war on the West African coast are, of course, far more dramatic and shocking, and this was deliberate. However, the earlier, more devastating arena of the loss of innocence, because it was so thoroughgoing, embracing an entire generational span, was under apartheid South Africa. That's where it began. And it goes back to the youth uprising of the early 1970s, the rejection, for instance, of Afrikaans. This uprising was inspired by the rejection of the Boer language as the common language for everyone. And the children then downed their books and said, the name of education is revolution. That revolution, in fact, is the only worthwhile classroom. That generation had got fed up with the humiliation they'd seen meted out to their parents, and I decided that they would not take it any longer. And so they took to the streets, and unbelievable cruelties took place within that generation. I believe that this was where the decay of the childhood formation as a space and a time of innocence began. Something similar, but without the excuse of the anti-apartheid struggle, is what we see taking place across many countries of the African continent today. I remember first observing it certainly it was at the cusp of the millennium. And that is when I put down a few lines, which I titled "The Children of This Land," which was which has been published in the volume Samarkand and Other Markets. I'll just read a few stanzas of that poem. The children of this land are old. Their eyes are fixed on maps in place of land. Their feet must learn to follow distant contours traced by alien minds. Their present sense has faded into past. These are the offspring of the dispossessed, the hope and land deprived. Contempt replaces filial bonds. The children of this land are castaways in hold crafts, all tortoise skin and scales, the callous of their afterbirth. Their hands are clawed for rooting. Their tongues propagate new social codes and laws. But the children of this land embrace the void as lovers. The spores of their conjunction move to people once human spaces, stepping nimbly over ghosts of parenthood. The children of this land are robed as judges. Their gaze rejects all measures of the past. A gleam invades their dead eyes briefly, lacerates the air, but with one sole demand: who sold our youth? Are we forced to conclude then that the Renaissance is a lost cause? Shall we proceed to pull down what is among us statue to Renaissance erected on the Colline de Mamel at the promontory of Dakar, declaring it meaningless, optimistic, merely symbolic? No, perhaps not so fast. There's evidently no lack of motion around the Renaissance plinth, whether symbolic or real. But the motion does appear to be in the wrong direction, or perhaps, to put it more generously, more optimistically, it experiences a series of moves and counter-moves, which of course can only result in seemingly permanent stasis. Lots of motion, but no movement. Africa, indeed, appears doomed to oscillate between the polarities of hope and despair. This is a conditioning that I would like to illustrate, however, by a morality tale, with two events as competing protagonists, two variations on one theme, each in stark contrast to the other, and a true reflection of the realities of a continent. I shall take them in the wrong order, on purpose. So, first, the latter. This took place in a subdued, quite minor key, far more deserving of exposure than was accorded it, and still lacking in popular awareness, to my surprise, even today, in far, far too many parts of the African continent. I refer to the parturition of a new voice for the continent, an independent communication and information access across borders, one that was designed to operate resolutely outside government control, even though powered by government volition, in partnership with the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. With an infectious confidence in its permanence, it was named Democracy Radio. Its full name, West African Democracy Radio. It was launched in August 2005, not long after the cessation of serial bloodletting in Liberia, that seemingly interminable phase of negativity. It was ultimately sealed out with that election I spoke of earlier. The launching took place in that same Dakar, Senegal. 4 democratically elected leaders committed to the mission of giving permanence to a potent tool of democracy on a continent that both European and African voices often declare when and as convenient, which is, I'm afraid, nearly all the time, has been historically and temperamentally unsuited to the democratic option of governance. We hear that so often. Unfortunately, at the last moment, it was supposed to have been established in Liberia itself, where the war had been taking place. At the last moment, the new Liberian president could not attend. So she sent a representative, however, and through her, a message which, despite its banter, encapsulated much of Africa's contemporary travails, even as it constituted a challenge to the host country, Senegal, as well as to other partners in that venture. What she said, the message she sent to the president of Senegal was, you know very well that this radio is supposed to be in Liberia. If you ever get exhausted, please just send it back to us. We'll gladly find space for it and monitor it and operate it. To have reached that point of being able to offer Liberia as the base for a democratic means of communication, it meant that that region at least has made tremendous strides. Assailing the minds of more than a handful of those who are present at that occasion must have been yet another radio, the Radio Mille Collines of Rwanda, which was used as the incitement instrument for the massacre of nearly 1 million lives within, it is estimated, about 3 weeks. The infamous elimination of humanity in Rwanda. But now, that was the same instrument being dedicated to the transmission of information, knowledge, exchange of ideas, to, in short, freedom, to the end in view of a genuine, authentic renaissance. History exists to guide and instruct us, sometimes to chastise, but also occasionally to comment and to vindicate. So let's finally seek relief also, albeit be it ridden with ambiguities, for just a few moments, from what may be considered one of the positive conversions of this history consciousness in leadership responsibility. I wish to end with a reminder, recalling your memory to a gesture of solace and solidarity from the mother continent after the nature disaster that befell a tiny island in the Caribbean known as Haiti, my fellow shit country. According to Donald, you know, we shit people, we must come to each other's aid. And so Senegal opened her doors to Haiti after that disaster, and this was repatriation, reverse and positive repatriation, the first since the repatriation of ex-slaves to found the colony of Liberia in 1822. It was a unique historic appropriateness about, there was, I beg your pardon, a unique appropriateness about President Wada's project, quite apart from its expression of solidarity and humanitarian commitment. Haiti, after all, and that's where I refer to history, after all, this was the first black republic of the modern world, founded and governed and sustained by defendants of slaves, those dehumanized forebears who are so readily evoked by cynical leaders to bring about a just general closing of ranks, a false solidarity. But let's not go back to the negative side of issues. What happened was that President Wade, at that very spot where he's erected this enormous statue to Renaissance, received, having invited plane loads of the displaced from Haiti, he received them at the very point from which they had departed as slaves. It was a heady initiative. Your ancestors, he said, left here by physical force. You have returned through moral force. You are neither strangers nor refugees. You are members of one family. That note more than summarizes a continent's dilemma. Yes, open doors, open arms, the famed virtue of hospitality and family ethos that is ascribed by leaders like Desmond Tutu to that principle known as Ubuntu. The open-air welcome was a formal family event. It was broadcast live on several African nations, undoubtedly also over that famous democracy radio. The Senegalese leader went so far as to promise to hand over an entire region of Senegal to those who took up the offer proved too numerous. He did not stop there. For the avoidance of doubt, he stressed that the nation would not offer the arid or sterile parts, but the fertile sections of Senegal. I know Senegal doesn't have too much fertile soil, so that was quite a grand gesture. Greater love has no man, and offer up his fertile soil to neighbors, impoverished neighbors, neighbors in need. For a mind attempting to grasp the scale of Haiti's earthquake catastrophe, beset by the disproportionate affliction on an already economically challenged nation, it was an invitation to seize to oneself a minuscule portion of that demonstration of the generosity, the humane spirit of a continent, of the Pan-African solidarity and mentality, to persuade oneself that it is not yet lost. So the question that I ask myself, however, today is this: would they remain? Would they remain? Will more follow? Should they? How bad, good, or livable with is home news these days to the diaspora? Wade had chosen that spot of Senegal's promontory, the very westernmost tip of the continent, as venue for the reception of the ancient castaways. This was the last spot your ancestors saw as they were carted away in slave ships. He solemnly declared, "It's only just that we receive you here on your return." The welcome ceremony took place under that statue. Abdoulaye Wade was speaking for the African continent, was hoping for the African continent. He named the African Renaissance that spot, the spot of the African Renaissance. If only humanity could live simply on the bread of history and the wine of symbolism, oh yes, indeed, then every day would be, what else? Renaissance feast. Thank you.